I find that people can get in trouble because often we don't really need more plasticity. We need shaping of it. To someone who's really suffering and trying lots of things and jacking up plasticity, the brain can take that changeability and can move it in the wrong direction. So you get somebody who's like really, really ADHD and they have ketamine, the theta brainwaves get released into high gear. Now they have severe stuck anxiety for months. So knowing your brain can also be navigate around that. You can look at your brain and figure out what meds or interventions might work. But I work with a lot of let's call them bros, the mix of finance bros, Silicon Valley bros, a lot of hard charge and biohacker types. And a lot of them come in microdosing constantly. And, every day they're microdosing.
Ketamine specifically or just other?
No, usually it's psilocybin. Sometimes, 20 years ago, it was modafinil through dint of Dave's talking about modafinil deficits. But, no, mostly it's mushrooms these days. And, I mostly say, well, look, if you need more plasticity, I'd almost rather you meditate and get more reliable plasticity. But the neurofeedback brings up plasticity each time you do it in a measurable way. So you might want to be a little cautious. And what I find a lot of the time, if people keep doing microdosing while doing neurofeedback, is the microdose turns into a macrodose. The sensitivity, the same thing happens with cannabis or with stimulants, Adderall, Ritalin, is that as you do neurofeedback, the brain gets way more sensitive to it.
Interesting.
And maybe 3 to 5 weeks in, like within a couple of days, suddenly all the plasticity is reset and cannabis hits you 3 times harder than you expected. Stimulants are twice as impactful. Psychedelics 3, 4, 5 times as impactful. And people are like, oh my gosh, did I take 2 Adderall? I feel crappy. Or did I have way too much weed? I can't get off the couch. And literally increased impacts from the things you're putting in your brain when you start doing brain work. So it's a little bit, I'm a little bit cautious. I'm not somebody to reach for every research chemical or peptide or random intervention. I'm more likely, okay, look at your brain. Where's the foundational stuff? Sleep, stress, and attention. What are you doing with your sleep hacking? How can we optimize these things? And I would only reach for really aggressive or unusual things like psychedelics under very narrow use cases. And only with a doctor on board. I have a good friend here in LA who does a lot of work with ketamine. And so I wouldn't ever recommend somebody I was working with be doing lots of that without having someone like an expert in that on board as well, because the variables can change really quickly when you're working on your brain and what you need can change quickly. So.
And that makes sense too. If essentially, the common trope is like set and setting for psychedelics. And so understanding the environment that you're putting yourself in, because you're essentially putting yourself not just for the temporary experience in a powerful state, right? But you're creating this high sense of plasticity. And so if you're creating a high sense of plasticity, you want to be setting yourself up for success to be in a positive environment to, again, kind of create the maybe behavioral changes of what you want to actually be incorporated.
I also think it's hard to get that harvest. It's hard to pull the psychological learning, the transformation out of, more ecstatic states with psychedelics or more shamanic states. Those are ordeal environments. And yes, we come back a little transformed, but the big problem with Western shamanism is that we go forth and trip our balls off and then don't have any growth from it the next day. We're still assholes to our wives and girlfriends, there's this problem with transformation. And I often, for people that are interested in that thing, will often get into a different category of neurofeedback called alpha theta, which creates this hypnagogic access, brings you to the place between awake and asleep, holds you there for 20 minutes or so. And that creates huge surges of healing, nonlinear awareness. This is, of course, what Dave's program is built around. 40 years is built around alpha theta, alpha synchrony. It's a very, very interesting experience. And that particular category, alpha theta, alpha synchrony training, I find serves the goals of a lot of people that are these psychonauts seeking the transformation, the next step, the esoteric knowledge. Alpha theta tends to give you that access where you can open the door inside yourself and step through into that place where things are sparkly and interesting and weird and unusual, and then step back through having not tripped your balls off. So you come out of an alpha theta session, you stand up and you're a little bit loopy for 5 minutes, and then you're walking around the rest of the day, chill, having experiences that are relatively grounded. And so you have this wonderful access into that state, but you aren't being forced into that state the way you might with a heroic or macro dose of a psychedelic. So, well, I think there are use cases for those drugs. I think that the stuff people want to get out of those drugs can be gotten without them generally.
That's one of the questions I wanted to ask about was, are there other ways to access these spaces? I had another guest on who talks about like even like music festivals and stuff, which I'm a big fan of and have gone on a ton, like act as these sort of like liminal spaces where we go on this like sort of interpersonal and extrapersonal like adventure that leads to a sense of transformation and goes into it. So like, can you share with whatever like what is going on in the brain in these kinds of experiences, even without psychedelics? And then like, what are some of the other ways that we can access this without substances or even without neurofeedback?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure I have an answer. I think it's a sociological answer to some extent, but really what you're doing there is creating a container and engaging in ritual expression, right? And so ritual expression is essentially creating a sacredness and then acting within it. And I think that is the set and setting you are creating. It can be a Fish concert, it can be Burning Man, it can be a sun dance ceremony, a sweat lodge. And, each will serve different purposes. But when we go into a music festival, we're going with certain perspective around what we're going to get out of it and what we like to do there. Some folks are never stopping moving and dancing. Some folks are taking drugs. Some folks like to relax and, sit in a blanket. And that is the ritual for that person. So I'm not sure I know what's happening in the brain, but I would argue that the reason that we tend to be drawn to those environments is because of the opportunity to practice the ecstatic experience, where we loosen the linear shape of the mind. We're allowed to kind of move away from the pure linear thoughts into the more expressive, the receptive, the insight-driven space, the creative space, the spiritual space. I think that's why those are so attractive, at the very least, even if I don't know what's actually happening during them.
Yeah. Why is that ecstatic experience so important to us as humanity?
Well, I mean, it's sort of, I don't know that it is for every individual. I think as a species, it's really important because there's deep learning there, and there's deep, art and emotion and healing and all the deep stuff. I mean, some of that, to get back to some of the idea of brain laterality, there's some early ideas in how laterality developed that posits the question that, well, maybe the reason we had spiritual experiences because the non-dominant hemisphere was sending language in. And hearing God was our non-dominant hemisphere. The Gillian James, The Origin of the Bicameral Mind, is a good book on that. The idea that the two hemispheres have this linguistic capacity, that temporal lobe epilepsy creates auditory hallucinations. And so we were hearing God because our non-dominant hemisphere was talking to us via an epilepsy phenomena, essentially. So I think that we spend a lot of time in a linear environment. We're solving problems, we're watching TV, we're being sold to, we're fighting, we're getting money, we're consuming. It's very linear. It's a very transactional way to be. And kind of like, think about all of us who sit at desks and we're in this cashew shape, all curled up all the time.
Right.
And then we find that kettlebells and yoga become super important because of the opposite, because they pull the body out and they teach the posterior chain to become really powerful so that you're not always curled up in a fetal position as a human. And I think that the ecstatic stuff becomes important for those of us for whom we are curled up in a linear position, to butcher the metaphor, where we're always in that like non-spiritual, non-abstract, non-nuanced, non-emotional, non-aware state. Some education, some irrigation of those tissues, of those abilities, can give people a lot of more rich human experience, but also as a place to go to do healing, to release trauma, to release crap. Mercedes Eliade, who described shamanism, talked about the shaman goes to extraordinary reality and then comes back to ordinary reality. But again, the problem is harvest, coming back with insight, especially because a lot of the things we use historically to get to those states are very altering. If you're doing your combo or your ayahuasca or your, heroic dose of LSD or something, yeah, you're going to have an experience, but are you going to be present enough to to learn from it? Or is it going to be like, wow, I had a cool experience 2 days ago. Well, I know I learned something. And if you do something that's not completely distorting, but gets you some of the same access, which can be dance, meditation with absorption practices, not awareness, like simple mindfulness, but like concentration, absorption practices, neurofeedback, intense exercise. I would argue if you're a musician, playing music at a high level with other people becomes one of those things as well, because it's a rich, nonlinear communication that you're just participating in instead of, deciding how it goes. And I think these are really important things that we may underemphasize in this modern Western linear world.